Brendan White.
They're not listening.
He's a special agent with the Secret Service that flies helicopters around to monitor what you're doing. No.
Yeah, right. In the video game that Brian was talking
He is special. He is a specialist. So he is your consultation specialist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So need your attention and respectfully be paying attention. Thank you. So he and Bruce Holland, who is I think you're the district wildlife biologist for the BLM. No, my gosh. I got to give him a promotion. He's a state wildlife biologist with the BLM. My apologies. They're going to be talking about, well, how are we really putting all of this together from their perspective? I said earlier that we need to, if we're going to do this, we need to do it in partnership. So I think it's very fitting that we have BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service giving this talk jointly. So they're going to talk about how are we interpreting the CHU rule and how does it relate to the Northwest Forest Plan and easy questions like that. So help me welcome Brendan, everybody.
Thank you. Let's see, as for whether this is where the rubber meets the road, that might depend on your definition of rubber and road. We might be a 4x4 in the mud and we might be a hovercraft, I'm not really sure. I wanted to start by thanking Cheryl for giving us the post-lunchtime slot. It's when I usually take a nap, but hopefully being up here will keep me awake. As for the rest of you, I don't know. I've asked them to turn up the heat. And Bruce and I prepared a bunch of slides with a lot of text, so I don't know what more we can do for you. So. Yeah. Okay. I think it's for, do I have to talk like that?
You're done. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? I don't have to duck my head like this? Okay. I asked Cheryl for this walk-around mic because I'm generally a little bit more kinetic than a lot of people that have been up here, and if I have to talk into this microphone, I'll be really dull, and you will definitely fall asleep. Let's see. I want to also thank Bruce for agreeing, I'm going to put that in air quotes because he's not sure he ever did, to do this presentation with me. I think just like the panel we had this morning, it's really important to be on the same page as the agencies that we're working with. So it's very helpful because it gets us together at all levels. So provisions of the Spotted Owl Critical Habitat Rule, how are we interpreting what it says, and how does it integrate with the Northwest Forest Plan? One of the things I think is really important to point out is that you can't really talk about the Critical Habitat Rule without considering, largely, the Revised Recovery Plan, because a lot of the Revised Recovery Plan is integrated into the Critical Habitat Rule, and also the Northwest Forest Plan. These three things go together, and we're going to talk about how some of that interplay is, but if you're looking at one and ignoring the other two, you're going to find yourself get caught up somewhere. So it's really important to keep that context. So some of this is going to be a little bit of review, but kind of setting the stage. We're doing sort of a top-down approach here. The goal of critical habitat designation is to aid in the conservation of the spotted owl through conservation and restoration of the ecosystem and those processes upon which the species relies. You heard that this morning from both Jim, I think from the panel as well. The Critical Habitat Rule is designed to support 3 of the 4 recovery criteria that are in our recovery plan, including a stable population trend, adequate population distribution, and continued maintenance and recruitment of spotted owl habitat. Okay, it's one of the 2 best things we can do to recover the spotted owl. Jim talked about the PBFs and the PCEs, the physical and biological features and the primary constituent elements. Those are those habitat characteristics that provide the spotted owl with those environmental conditions that are going to lead to its conservation and survival. Okay? Our goal is to retain and restore those elements to provide for conservation. We've listed them there. We've talked about them before. Okay, special management considerations. Jim also talked about this. I want to get a little bit more specific about what we mean by some of these things. Okay? And so this is a little bit of review, but there's 2 main special management considerations. The first one's conserve older stands that contain the conditions to support northern spotted owl occupancy or high-value northern spotted owl habitat as described in Recovery Actions 10 and 32. 10 is retaining occupied sites on the landscape. Recovery Action 32 is those complex multi-stage, multi-layered stands. Someone asked a question earlier about Recovery Action 32 or that older, higher quality habitat. Generally speaking, we don't think you should have to do a whole lot of management to retain those, There are situations, however, and recovery plan identifies these, where you have threats like fire or insects, where you might need to do some management within those to retain them, okay? I know that's a lot of text. I apologize. However, I've bolded it for you to pull out some special stuff here. So the other special management consideration is to actively manage forests to restore ecosystem health where necessary and appropriate, okay? The main one, and we've heard this before, focus active management in younger stands, lower quality owl habitat, or where ecological conditions are most departed from the natural or desired range of variability. These are the areas we'd really like to see you do work, where we recommend you do work in spotted owl critical habitat. We would also ask you to avoid active northern spotted owl territories. This is Recovery Action 10, retaining them on the landscape. We'd recommend in the moist forest to follow Northwest Forest Plan guidelines. In the dry forest, look at those stands that are most at risk of experiencing uncharacteristic disturbance. Okay, those are the areas we're going to need to do management to retain those habitat characteristics in the face of fire, climate change, and that sort of thing. If you look back at number 1, that focus active management in younger stands, that's going to read a lot like what you see in the Northwest Forest Plan for LSR management guidelines. That should make sense because in LSRs we're talking about managing for spotted owl habitat. In critical habitat we're talking about managing for spotted owl critical habitat, for the development and speeding up development of critical habitat, or excuse me, spotted owl habitat. So those two things look similar, and that should make sense to us. And where commercial harvest is planned, we would ask you and recommend considering a stronger focus on ecological forestry. Do something different than the standard regeneration harvest from the Northwest Forest Plan. Okay, so what does this really mean? I want to give you an example of kind of how we see this operating on the ground. If you are in a watershed and you've determined that there's a dearth of high quality early cereal habitat, you want to restore some of that, we would recommend that you would go into some of the younger stands, some of those overstocked plantations, and do some of that restoration there, as opposed to going into, say, a 70-year-old stand that's on a pretty high trajectory to develop into spotted owl habitat, okay? We talked a little bit about moist and dry forests. This is a diagram from the critical habitat rule. Brian talked about the 11 modeling zones. We split those up into 4 different, or modeling regions, excuse me. We split those up into 4 different ecological zones. Generally the wetter west side, the drier east side, the Klamath that has both wet and dry, and the redwood area that's different on its, totally different than anywhere else and has all kinds of special ways to go about that. Within the critical habitat rule, there's specific management recommendations for those different areas. Okay, special management considerations at a greater landscape scale. The recovery of the spotted owl requires the sufficient high quality habitat to allow for population growth. Okay, so we have a population of owls out there. Not every acre of critical habitat is currently in habitat for spotted owls, but that's okay because we need the population to grow. So, let's see, for population growth and recovery, portions of the habitat mosaic and some subunits consist of younger or partially harvested forests. We've considered these essential because they're capable of developing the PCEs and providing for population growth. That's what we need to meet our recovery criteria from the recovery plan. Okay? So where you want to do restoration projects for spotted owl habitat, these young stands would be a great place to go where we could speed up the development of spotted owl habitat that's going to provide for nesting, roosting, foraging, and transients. We realize that not every project you're going to do is going to be restoration oriented, but those that are, this is where we'd like to see you focus them. That would be our recommendation. I want to touch on consultation effects determinations. This was something that changed significantly from the proposed rule to the final rule. So we encourage the level 1 consultation teams to tailor their scale of effects determinations to the localized biology of the life history needs of the northern spotted owl. We give you some examples: a stand scale, a 500-acre scale, or other appropriate localized scale. Different level 1 teams do this at different scales, and we just ask you to identify that and tailor it to your local biology. And effects analyses should consider both the spatial and the temporal implications of projects. Well, what do we mean by this? I'm a big fan of looking at a large landscape. If you can plan out a larger landscape, we can do a consultation that covers a bigger area over a longer period of time. That helps us really consider, encompass, encapsulate the longer-term conservation needs of the owl. However, if you're looking at a big landscape and you're going to treat a bunch of acres in the next year versus the next 20 years, that's going to change your effects determination, because over the longer period of time, you're going to have ingrowth or some other things going on that are going to provide for some restoration of those areas you've treated, maybe before you get to the end of your project. So temporal scale is really important when it comes to doing your effects determination. So integration with the Northwest Forest Plan, we explicitly included the Northwest Forest Plan in the critical habitat rule, and here's some examples. The designation of areas of critical habitat does not change the land use allocations. Active adaptive management within critical habitat is compatible with the Northwest Forest Plan. Let's see, potential management considerations for the owl are intended to be fully compatible with the standards and guidelines as informed by the 2011 revised recovery plan, whereby to provide for a means whereby ecosystems on which the northern spotted owls depend will be conserved. So we were explicit about including considerations for the Northwest Forest Plan. Here's a few more quotes. All BLM and Forest Service lands in critical habitat in this rule fall under the Northwest Forest Plan and should be managed consistent with those standards and guides. And with barred owls now sharing the range of the spotted owl, conservation of spotted owls outside of reserved areas is increasingly important for species recovery. We talked about that this morning as well. I think it was Lee talked about some proportion of the landscape that's outside of reserves, that's within critical habitat. However, we fully recognize the ecological functions and land use management goals of the different land use allocations as outlined in the Northwest Forest Plan. Not everything is going to be geared towards restoration, and we understand that, and we explicitly state that. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Bruce. Wait, one more pretty picture. There you go. You want the walk around?
Is that working? Excellent. So I came back to the Northwest just on time to be here for the start of the critical habitat plan. And ever since I got here, I think the field biologists with the BLM have been saying I've been making life for them more complex. This simplification is for you. And what I'm going to present is largely based on my experience and observations of what you're doing out in the field. Your own experiences may vary. Are we down arrow? Different down arrow. So how are we doing with kind of the application of the concepts in the critical habitat rule, which, as Brendan and others have said, also incorporates a fair amount of the recovery plan? And I preface all this with the word generally, because it's not always, but generally we're avoiding those older, more structurally diverse stands, the RA32 type stands, but not always. Sometimes, as others have pointed out, there's good reasons for doing those, for doing actions within those to protect other higher quality or more higher value areas. We're doing a pretty good job of considering the context and looking for opportunities in planning. We're bounded by the critical habitat rule. We're also bounded by the Northwest Forest Plan and it's implementing LRMPs and RMPs. A lot of what we do when we start out planning isn't just where's the critical habitat and where are the owls. We have multiple lenses we look through when we get to that planning. And what I've seen that's been, we're using those multiple prescriptions that are place-based and landscape aware. And we're not treating critical habitat as a reserve. I think I've seen a lot of people who are planning units not to avoid critical habitat and not in spite of critical habitat, but because of it. They're looking for those opportunities. those are the positives, I think. These are some things that I think we have a little bit more work to do. And mostly they're about scale and intensity. It's how we describe those. Planning within critical habitat, much less the Northwest Forest Plan, is hard. It's complex. It's probably going to stay that way. It's not going to get any easier. I had the second bullet up there, I had a much more complex statement about desired future conditions and expected trajectories, and Jim Thrailkill made it a whole lot easier for me, and he said, what I want to know is what for, why here, and why now. And we need to be aware of that and say why. Why are we doing what we're doing here? What's the purpose? And put it in context. Back to that landscape, we need to avoid being stand-centric. Critical habitat is not a tree. It's the arrangement of trees and other biological and physical factors on the landscape. We need to be aware of that. Our analysis effect, and sometimes you could call this good, sometimes it's a quandary to me. But habitat has scale. Let's keep our scale in mind. And this is for the land management agencies out there. No happy talk. Own our actions. Be explicit. If the primary purpose of your action in critical habitat is because you've determined it's the best place to meet your volume targets, say so. If you're modifying that action slightly to have less impact or to mitigate for that, you can say that too, but be explicit in your primary purpose and make sure that what you said is what you intend to do. And lastly, I don't know that there's a single right answer or right answers, but I'm pretty sure there's several wrong ones. And we'll learn those as we go. Back to my first statement, planning under Northwest Forest Plan and critical habitat is hard. Integration with Northwest Forest Plan, this is, to borrow again, where the rubber meets the road. This is these are the bounds we operate under. In simple terms, the Northwest Forest Plan is intended to provide for two things, two needs: forest habitat, forest products. That said, it's a multiple species, multiple purpose plan. All the land allocations have a dominant purpose, but within that purpose may have additional expected functions. When we plan, keep your context and your purpose. That multiple lens approach is important, and we need to carry that through in our analysis. Critical habitat, the other bound on what we're talking about today, is the area required for the conservation of the species. And the bottom line there, for whatever we say, is that federal agencies must avoid destruction or adverse modification. So the Northwest Forest Plan created a framework through the standards guides. It set a series of, depending on your land allocation, the minimum and maximum limits for your allowable management. That's our current law of land. We must operate under that. But at the same time, we can't really violate Section 7 either. So you have to deal with all of those things. We have matrix. The primary purpose of matrix was to provide for the forest product section. A significant portion of the existing matrix is now overlain with critical habitat. How we maneuver around within that to achieve our goals is going to depend on how far down the road we get before we run right up against one of those bounds, whether it be our Northwest Forest and Plan standards and guides or the adverse mod limitation. And within all of this, Northwest Forest Plan, part of its consideration was to meet your 7A1 responsibilities. That responsibility, we retain that responsibility through time. It doesn't go away. It's not single purpose. Which sort of brings you to you read those two slides and you think, wow, do you think there's an opportunity for conflict out there? I do anyway. I guess that's what I think about. And how do you get around it? Well, I think part of what to remember, and you've heard this more than once, is that critical habitat is not an absolute prohibition on management. Adverse effect is not the same thing as adverse mod. From a critical habitat standpoint, there's probably good adverse effect where you manipulate stand conditions in the understanding that you're doing so to enhance future conditions, and you can do so with reasonable surety that you're not going to result in a long-term degradation. And you can do matrix regen harvest as long as you don't cross that threshold. And when we get to that bottom line of legal responsibility, it doesn't really matter when you butt up against the adverse mod line. It doesn't matter if we do it with 10 acres of regen, 20 acres of ecological forestry, or 50 acres of thinning. The bottom line is we've crossed a threshold that we don't get to legally. So back to be explicit, own your actions. And I'm going to quote Mr. Thrailkill again. Say why here, why now, and keep it in your landscape context. So I think this is true. I think we'll probably have, the debate will be where these lines are, and we will have them, and we'll probably keep having them. But I think there's inherent flexibility in Northwest Forest Plan and their implementing plans that will be available to us. That we're going to be able to do forest management actions that will not be inconsistent with the recommendations or the purpose of the critical habitat rule. My caveat is to a point. That at some point, and that point will be dependent on other factors, other responsibilities under the plan, things that change. We just burned up 60 some odd thousand acres in southwestern Oregon. That changes our calculus a little bit. But this is the framework you're operating under. So you need to be compliant with your standards and guides. You need to avoid your adverse mod. And what you do within those frameworks needs to be well described and put in a context that allows us to look at the landscape that you're taking those actions in and where you're driving the landscape. I'm going to finish with that one because if at the end of this year your copies of those don't look a lot worse than mine, we're probably not using them enough.
Context on what it means for the spatial size of restoration actions? Is that short answer is no, I can't. That's not really punting. It really varies. I'm a fan of looking at really large landscapes if you can plan that far ahead. I think because you really can capture the longer term effects to any species, not just spotted owl, but certainly any species. On the ground, depending on where you are in the range of the species, the level 1 folks should be the experts there, and I don't want to, if I gave you a number, it'd be wrong in some places, maybe right in some, but I'm probably not the right person to do that for you. Sorry. Bruce might be the right person, I don't know.
I think part of that is the scale of your action. Did I lose my microphone? Oh. That how big's your action will inform how big your landscape needs to be. If your action is pretty small, small being that relative term, then you probably don't need to go to expansive multi-watershed scale assessment. There are some things that are just valid on their face, and you can put them into context of how that action might alter the habitat. And again, habitat has scale. What habitat are we talking about? That 200 hectare generally assumed to represent a core area habitat scale, or are you looking at or is your impact big enough that you want to talk about your local metapopulation? I think those are all, I think Brendan and I are going to tell you the same thing. It's fact dependent, and
We're both going to tell you no. I think.
We're not going to give you a good answer.
One more. One question. There's a lot of language in both the recovery plan and the rule that speaks to following this guidance where consistent with landscape goals, or where it lines up with your purpose and need, and not recognizing owls are not the sole driver. Sometimes that leads to the perception that like a purpose and need in WUI or matrix or something else might trump owl things. Like what would your response be to that, to balancing those? What does that language intended to mean, you know?
Okay, so the question is, let's see, often in the rule we talk about following our recommendations where it's consistent with the landscape purpose and need, or the management purpose and need, but in some cases, maybe WUI or matrix or something like that, that might be conflicting with our recommendations. We fully realize that the land management agencies have mandates that are outside of necessarily just what we're recommending in critical habitat. And that's why we say, here's what we'd like you to do. We'd like you to operate in the younger forest, those places that are overstocked, those places where you can restore habitat more quickly. But in those areas where you're going to do a commercial timber harvest, which we realize, we're going to ask you there to try and do it in a way that has less of an impact by following ecological forestry techniques. So in the WUI, I would say go in there and do what you need to protect that, the buildings and the people and all that kind of thing. In Matrix, we realize that there's going to be some commercial forestry. We'd ask you to do it a little bit of a different way. Does that answer your question? Not really. Okay.
If you're writing the BO and you have to address, how they've lined up with the recovery of the species, if they considered conserving occupied sites but couldn't do that and meet a WUI goal, then can we still write that that's consistent with the recovery plan because they've considered it?
The first thing I have to do is repeat your question, which is, oh my gosh. So if you consider the recommendations in the recovery plan, the critical habitat rule, but you can't meet them, are you still consistent with them?
If you can't do them and meet your purpose and need.
Right. So see, every time you add something, I have to repeat it. Let's see. So yes, if you need to do something different than our recommendations to meet your purpose and need, is that consistent with the recovery plan and the critical habitat rule? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we have to analyze that and disclose that.
Right. And I'm going to, see now I got to repeat that? No, I'm kidding. I'm going to say yes, it is consistent, and here's why. Because we recognize that that's a mandate, that's something you have to do. Sometimes your purpose and need lines up directly with the recommendations in both the recovery plan and the critical habitat rule, and sometimes they don't. We recognize that explicitly, and we move forward. We'll consult on it, and we hope it doesn't reach anywhere near adverse modification. I think one of the things that can really help is if you know you're going to have impacts that aren't moving us towards recovery, but maybe going the other direction, having other projects in the same area that might provide some of that restoration in those younger stands, or in a stand that's on a trajectory that's not going to quite get to spotted owl habitat, but if you went and did some variable density management, some thinning, something like that, it might. I'm going to see, Paul, did you want to add anything to that, or are you just standing up? Okay. I hope that helped. Oh, good.
I would think RA10 would be, I would apply RA10 first and see how that fits.
So Randy would apply RA10 for.
A bigger scale, is this like one of 2 active owls in the watershed, or 1 in 10?
Okay.
That kind of stuff to provide context.
What if you're just seeing the majority of owls in the watershed?
Okay, I'm going to bring you this.
Okay, let's do this, though, because we've got 3 more speakers, and then we're going to have a chunk of time for questions and answers. So
Okay, good.
Does that help? So
My answer helped.
Let me take these guys off. Let me take these guys off the hook, and help me thank them, everybody. Here we go. All right, I told you Brendan was special. And Bruce, thank you for quoting my husband so much. I'm going to have to start listening to him more often.